Why do you say that, Father? You aren't afraid, are you?
No, but I respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
Broadcasting live from our Sanctum Sanctorum in Bakersfield, California. This is the Sixth Sense Society. I'm your host, Krista, here with our producer, Michael. And today we're really excited to have on the show musician and author Gary Lachman. Some of you may know he was one of the founding members of the great rock group Blondie. And I know him mostly through his writing. He's written more than 20 books on topics that are really appropriate for our show. But it ranges from the evolution of consciousness in the Western esoteric tradition to literature and suicide in the history of popular culture. I also found him extremely accessible with a lot of depth in his books. So I'm really excited to have him on the show for today's topic, which is going to be about the occult in modern politics. And, you know, the U.S. is having a huge election this year, so we can't wait to talk to him about it. But before we get started, Michael has a few announcements.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our show. Yes, very excited to do this show. Next week, we have Spell It Out, Magic, Reflections, and Shadows, and we're going to have a very special guest join us. So you guys want to, I'm not going to tip off who it is, so check that in, come on in and join us for that. First Saturday of every month from 10 till 12 Pacific in the morning, we have a virtual meet and greet. It's free. Just go onto our website and RSVP for that. Come hang out with us, tell us about the show, and just chit-chat. And while you're there, if you're on the website, if you can afford to, buy us a coffee on Ko-Fi. Helps us cover all of our production costs, and we appreciate that. But the most important thing, go to YouTube, click like and subscribe, help us grow our show, and that we truly do appreciate. So I don't want to take up any time today because it's such a great guest, and we're so looking forward to it. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to you. So take it away, Krista and Gary.
Great. Thank you, Michael, and welcome, Gary.
Oh, well, thank you very much for inviting me to be on the show.
And I wanted to mention, too, congratulations to your latest book, Maurice Nicole, Forgotten Teacher of the Fourth Way. I know that came out this year, right?
Well, it just came out this month in the US, and it'll be out next month in the UK. And for those who don't know, Maurice Nicole was, he was, I don't think anyone else was like him in the sense that he had Jung, P.D. Uspensky, and Gurdjieff all as teachers, and he had close relationships with Jung and Uspensky, and lots of other stuff too. So that's a new thing that's out.
That's wonderful. Yeah, those quite some mentors there. I would say just one of them would be
Absolutely,
fascinating.
yeah.
Very, very fortunate. So I know that you have written two books in the past that are related to our topic, Politics and the Occult and Dark Star Rising, which I read the Dark Star Rising book, which gave me the sort of inspiration to ask you to talk about it, because I was kind of blown away by what you put together in that book that I just didn't know anything about, which I think a lot of people don't know about. And I think that this topic is really important for like everyone, not just the United States.
Absolutely. I mean, and just to say that following from Dark Star Rising, Magic and Power in the Age of Trump is the subtitle, which it was about all this strange kind of occult politics surrounding Trump's campaign and early years. But I also write quite a bit about Russia in the book there, and I had quite a bit of material left over, and so I wound up writing a book about Russia as well called The Return of Holy Russia. Which takes some of the stuff in Dark Star and puts it in this context of Putin's attempt to revitalize and somehow appropriate this image that Russia had in the 19th century of being holy Russia, like this mystical kind of nation with a mystical destiny and all this sort of thing. So, but no, I mean, I'll tell you the truth, I didn't know much about what was in Dark Star Rising until I actually did the research. And I mean, the first book, Politics and the Occult, that came out in 2008. And that was just more like a general survey. And the theme there was that, you know, when you talk about politics and the occult, it's usually far right, you know, fascism, Nazis, or, you know, in a general popular kind of sense, you know.
Right.
So, and most mainstream intellectuals, if they look at it like Umberto Eco and others, that's the stance they take. But if you actually look at the history, yes, of course, there's all of that, but there is what we could call a progressive. And my saying this, I don't want to say like I'm not on the bad guy's side, but I'm not saying the progressive meaning it's good. It's just what we would characterize.
Right.
Put it in a nutshell, in 1872, the first woman to run for president in the United States, Victoria Woodhull. Obviously, she didn't win.
Right.
But she was a mesmerist and a faith healer, but also a free love advocate, and she published the first, I believe, English translation of the Communist Manifesto. At the same time, she ran a brokerage firm on Wall Street. So she got around, but she was vilified as Mrs. Satan and all this kind of stuff. So, say, okay, go a century later in 1967, when there was the anti-Vietnam War march on Washington. You have people like Allen Ginsberg, Kenneth Anger, the Crowleyan filmmaker, Norman Mailer, the novelist, and others attempting to levitate the Pentagon.
Oh, I never heard that.
And they're on a flatbed truck shouting "Out, demons, out!" and all this kind of thing. So it was this, they're far left as far as you could possibly go. So it's not only the right wing stuff tends to get the press,
sure,
for different reasons, mostly I think because it's sexier somehow. Nobody is even though there was a lot of weird sort of paranormal, quasi occult stuff happening during the Stalin years. It's just not sexy. Whereas somehow all the black leather and all that, that's all that kind of insignia,
right?
It seems to go with it. So that was the premise for that book, and then. When almost 10 years, it came out 10 years later, Dark Star Rising. The premise for that was just after Trump won the election. I mentioned the alt-right before we went on. Does anybody remember them? Richard Spencer, who was sort of the head of the alt-right at the time, the alternative right. They were kind of like the acceptable face of far right, conservatism and all that kind of stuff. But he was also the head of something called the National Policy Institute, which sounds innocuous enough, but is actually, again, a rather far right kind of group. But they had their annual meeting, just the day after Trump won the election. And this was on CNN. This is like on the news and all that. Spencer had already, been a media, sort of magnet for a while. And I forget that other guy's name. I can't remember the Greek guy had the unpronounceable name, but he had like a bestseller book coming out before it was even published, and then it got pulled because of these comments he made about, underage sex with, men and all this. In any case, he came marching in to this meeting, saying, "Hail Trump, hail our hero." Then he said, we made this happen. We made this dream come true. We willed, this into being, blah, blah, blah kind of thing. And, all those kind of salutes that he later claimed were Roman salutes. Oh, of course, we misinterpreted them. But that all was on CNN. But a New Age blogger, someone who wrote about New Thought, mental science, thoughts are things, all the kind of popular law of attraction and The Secret and a variety of other stuff. He said, this sounds like they were using kind of New Thought techniques or ideas to somehow, help Trump get elected. And so my editor at my Penguin at the time, my publisher at the time, he said, what do you think about this? And I said, okay, well, let me just look into it. And then he said, well, once I pulled that thread, you discovered that Trump himself was a longtime devotee of Norman Vincent Peale, who's this American, religious reverend, and but he wrote this book called The Power of Positive Thinking, which is it's still like a bestseller in the sense that it still sells, thousands of copies every year. And this came out in the 50s originally, but it was a kind of Christianized version of this mental science, New Thought, of how you could focus your thought and you could basically make things happen out in the world,
right?
And Trump, when he was young, his father used to take the family to these sermons that Peale gave, and then he himself became a devotee of that. And how should we say, the influence that Norman Vincent Peale had on Trump can be gauged by this remark he made. He said, after sitting through one of his sermons, he said, I could sit through another one of those for another hour. And for a guy who's known to have an attention span of a gnat, you know what I mean? It's actually no attention span whatsoever. The idea that he would, want to stay and listen to another lecture, it must, mean something to him. So his whole thing, Trump's, not the whole thing, but this whole idea was this kind of, he just ignores everything that doesn't fit into the reality that he wants to make happen.
Well, one thing.
Sorry, I'm going on and on.
No, I just wanted to say that.
That was like the first two steps, and then, but no, oops, I'm sorry, I'm going on.
No, you're not. I just wanted to say that one thing about Trump, I never heard that anywhere, and it really helped to understand him, actually. It made a little more sense than anything else, like, oh, he's crazy, he's got dementia, I thought, wow, I could see why he is the way he is because of that concept. And I thought that was really helpful, that bringing that idea out.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just discovered that when I said, okay, I'll look into him. Oh, wow, I didn't know that. So I read a few of his, self-help books, how you could be a winner too, and all that kind. I'm a winner. It's like you always say positive things. It's never, I'm a winner. I'm this is that. It's always what you want, and it's how should we say? It's result based, and it's a kind of mental practice, but it's aimed at an actual result in the real world, right? So, and then getting back to the alt-right. Okay, so if they were using New Thought, in what way? And this is when the chaos magic side of it comes into it. Just in a general term, the whole idea that, rather than sticking to the traditional regalia and impedimenta magic with the circles and the incense and the candles and getting the name of the demon right and all that, you basically just use whatever's at hand. And there's a history of that. I mean, Crowley does something like that, and on one of, like, he's walking across China, and he's still working on some, he's climbing the totem pole still of the the Golden Dawn kind of grade level, and there's I forget exactly which one he was at, but he had to perform some ritual in order to make the grade, and he didn't have any of the things around him. But then he thought, well, it's all thought anyway, in one sense. So I'll just imagine I have them. And so you have to imagine him on sort of horseback or donkey back going across Southeast Asia with his wife and their young baby, the child who dies at the end of it, sadly. But him doing this, whatever he's doing, and then Spare, or Austin Osman Spare, he's doing something similar too. So it's all becomes more and more about the imagination, the power of the imagination of the magician, rather than the technique, getting everything perfect. And so it gets into like, well, we can use anything, just in a way like found art. You're walking down the street, you find something in the gutter, you pick it up and you put it on the mantelpiece. It was junk, now it's art. Yeah. You've transformed it. You've performed a magical or alchemical act on it. You've turned it from one thing into rubbish into gold, lead into gold. So similarly, you use whatever at hand. And so what was at hand for the, alleged New Thought advocates, magicians who helped Trump win, was the internet and memes. And this is, when it gets really weird, it's all Pepe the Frog kind of stuff. So this is like, again, this is like, how old is who? This is so this is so pre-COVID, who, Pepe who? But at the time it was like it was all over the place as it was. But oh God, so, all right. So, and I found similarities between, in essence, the fundamentals of sort of the aims and objectives of chaos magic and the kind of positive thinking that Trump grew up in. And they're very similar. They're both results based. You know? It's not, they don't want to do this Golden Dawn magic where, you know, it's mystical and you have a conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel. That's a bore. They want stuff to happen out there in the world, you know.
Well, it'll be interesting to see now that he's a convicted felon if his positive thinking is going to help. I mean, he is still running for president. So on some level, it is still helping.
Well, I mean, you know, I guess the whole, what do you want to say? One of the things is if you're good at, you turn those things to your advantage to some way.
Yeah.
So I'm no political analyst, and you know what I hear over here, you know, in the UK is reports that his popularity rating is still very high. Biden is low, I don't know. For some people, it's kind of like the martyr, I guess. You know, he's going through that kind of process. So yes, of course, this is going to happen. But I mean, what do you want to say? Rationally speaking, thinking, you would think at some point he's just going to hit a wall. Yeah. You know, it happens. You know, so I mean, you can keep it going for a while, and I mean, the best magic happens unconsciously. You know, it's like you sleepwalk through it, and everything seems to doors open for you, even when you don't have to ring the bell or anything like that. But then something happens at some point, and you lose that kind of whatever it is, that kind of inner confidence. And so I don't know, but I mean, back then this was, I mean, I haven't followed, you know, post after writing the book on Russia. That was like the last time, because but the guy who's still, you know, around, who was around then, you know, and I write about in Dark Star Rising, and still is this fellow Alexander Dugan, you know, this strange character who started out as an anti-Soviet punk in the 80s, and now he lectures on geopolitics to, you know, the chief of staff at the Kremlin. Wow. So he's gone through a remarkable, talk about like, you know, what you can do. And he's someone who's, at least from what I understand from what I read about him, although given it's kind of this postmodern kind of magic and stuff, it's like, well, how much is real? How much isn't real? How much do you take seriously? How much is a joke? Oh, well, you know what I mean? It's all, that's part of it. Part of it is the kind of, and that was another theme in Dark Star, was the whole, we live in a time now where I think everything is plausible, but nothing is definite. So it's a time where all these kind of shifting kind of possibilities seem to be happening. And in a way, I say in Dark Star Rising, Trump's election was the singularity that people have been talking about, but it wasn't the one that they expected. You know, it wasn't, you know, Terence McKenna's singularity or you know, the 2012 singularity. But I say that in the sense that after a singularity, or whenever they happen, everything is different, or in one, and that's what happened, at least immediately after Trump's election. It's just like this whole stuff, like everything is possible. Yes, it is possible, but everything is possible. When you feel oppressed, I mean, the idea of everything being possible is like some fantastic liberating thing, but when it's like, it's the everything, it's like, well, it's not only all the wonderful stuff that you've been hoping to happen. And with Trump, I just think he probably wouldn't know postmodernism if he stepped in it, or maybe in the sense of, you know, he was, you know, in architecture, so build me something postmodern. Right. You know, the whole idea that reality was malleable and up for grabs. Yeah, that I'll go for that. So he was prime for that. So I think what's been happening over the past several years, all the world's, or at least certainly, you know, America and here in Europe as well, in similar but different ways. Which is an oxymoron. But it's this whole notion of reality is like losing its, you know, the stability that it had at one point, and we see this in a number of ways. Sure. Yeah, with the AI and everything as well coming into the picture. And this, I know you sort of allude to it in Dark Star about, are we in sort of a magical war or not? And also, I don't know if you said it in a book, but the idea that magic's kind of here, but it's not what we expected. And you think that
even with positive thinking, people think that word positive means good. And obviously in this context, it can be used in any fashion, that kind of thinking.
Yeah. Well, that's like, if you say Hitler was an idealist, people say, what? Well, he actually was an ideal. He had an ideal. Doesn't mean it was a good ideal,
Right.
But it was, it was a visionary in that sense. So, and much of what we would call occult politics, or as James Webb, very early in the 1970s, he sadly blew his brains out in 1980, but he early in the 1970s, he was doing this kind of historical research into links between the occult and politics before, way before anybody else was doing it, really. But you talked about this kind of transcendental politics, and in the sense that it's politics pursued for aims that are not the usual aims that we associate with politics, utilitarian, whatever, high standard of living, getting the trains running and all that. No, it's this transcendental, which is idealist. It's an ideal. And so positive thinking isn't necessarily, it's positive in the sense that you were just positive about it, that's all, and you ignore everything else. It's a kind of tunnel vision, which is Trump himself says in one of his books, that it's a kind of, I forget what the phrase he uses, but it's a kind of voluntary tunnel vision, and which I suspect doesn't come too difficult.
Yeah. It seems like, too, that if people only do that, from my experience of knowing people that do that, it sort of creates a larger shadow in the person. And because we are, complex human beings, and so perhaps that could even explain how Trump seems to have gotten worse over the years from when he...
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you ignore, all this other part of yourself, thinking, and you have to remember, it's our everyday ego that is making, setting the aims, for the positive thinking. So, and it's like the prosperity gospel, or a variety of other sorts of things, or the Buddhist sects who chant for getting, a new TV or something like that. So there is that. And what do you want to say? It's kind of, it's sort of using this sort of creative imagination for, fundamentally kind of low aims and low purposes. But that's a kind of form of magic. I don't know whether you want to call it black or whatever, but it's basically, all of the traditions say, when you're on the path, wherever the path might be heading, if you practice the discipline assiduously, you will arrive at some point where, the cities, whatever the magical kinds of things will happen. But don't linger there, because it's not about that and all that kind of thing. So, I mean, I don't know, we'll have to see. But the interesting thing for me, and I believe we still live in this world now, and nobody talks about the new normal anymore. So I guess we're in it. So it's not that new anymore. I mean, that's
true.
A couple of years ago, it was, the new normal. And it's like, I haven't heard that in a while. So we must be in it now, whatever that is. But for me, that new normal, you were saying magic is everywhere. This was the strange thing for me, was because all the stuff that in my world, was on the fringe for the longest time, and you sort of had to go out of your way, more or less, to find it, and it was occupied this fringe, part of the cultural world. It was suddenly smack center in the middle, because someone like Steve Bannon, who, again, he's not, well, he's in the news every now and then, but he was very much on Trump's bench then, and he was the one who enabled the alt-right to be able to flood the internet with images of Pepe the Frog, this innocuous amphibian slacker who was appropriated by them and became this kind of magical talisman that they had posted in all these different memes, him looking over the wall, the Mexican wall, or Pepe with the deplorables, and Pepe as Trump, So the whole idea was like, it was this notion that it was notion that, okay, as in synchronicity, I'm sort of going tangential here, but this was, Bannon was the one who allowed them to do this. And the whole idea was that, okay, as in synchronicity, something's happening in the mind and something's happening out in the real world, and they're connected. And I would say magic is a kind of induced synchronicity in a certain way, is a kind of definition of it. So let's transpose that from the mind to the world, to the internet in the world. And this is, again, in this context of a whole nexus of different ways in which the simulacra became the reality. The representation became the reality, right? There's various different ways in which that was going on, and still is today. Even as you said, AI, even more so. That's what I mean. Nobody says the new normal anymore. We're in it. It's not that new. But that was the whole sort of thing. So if they flooded the internet with images of Pepe as Trump already being president, that would somehow bleed into the real world, and an echo of it would happen in the real world. So what took place in the internet would, so life imitating art, as Oscar Wilde said a long time ago. So, but the other thing about that is that Bannon was a reader of Julius Evola, the Italian 20th century far right, fascist-friendly, esoteric writer, and actually magician too. I mean, he practiced the form of magic, and it's a particular kind. It's more of a kind of Greco-Roman. It's not Kabbalistic. It's not that kind of magic. It's a kind of magic that he goes back to those sorts of roots. And in the 1920s, just as the alt-right was saying that they were performing a kind of magic, chaos magic, using what was at hand, memes on the internet, to influence the election, Evola in the 1920s was performing, not with memes because there wasn't the internet and that kind of stuff, but old school kinds of rituals in this Greco-Roman kind of context to influence Mussolini's fascista, because he didn't think they were fascist enough. It's the kind of apologist for Evola. I mean, he's quite brilliant, actually. He's worth reading if you can get past all of this, to me rather objectionable racist, stuff that he goes off on a tangent with him. It's just, but in other ways, he knows what he's talking about, at least in these contexts. But he's often said, well, he never joined the fascist party. No, he didn't. But the reason he didn't is he thought Mussolini's fascists weren't actually fascist enough. They were too sloppy and lazy, and he was making too many deals with the church. Because Mussolini was a politician, so he really had to get he didn't get the church behind him. It wouldn't happen. So, but Bannon was reading him, and he's Evola is part of the school that's known as traditionalism. And it's a kind of fundamentalist esotericism. René Guénon, the reign of quantity. And the basic idea was that in the dim ages ago, there was a fundamental revelation of human life and its relation to the cosmos and the divine. And all of the religions somehow shared in that. But over time, they've all drifted away. And they go by the Hindu, yuga, the different ages, and we're in the Kali Yuga. We're really like in the, or the Greek Iron Age. We're in the really worst possible time, because we've lost touch with tradition. We've lost touch with the ancient traditions and all that. And so democracy and socialism and egalitarianism and all this kind of secular stuff is just completely wrong. It's nothing but the evidence that the Western world is gone into decline and all that. So this is kind of Evola's kind of background. That's why he's very interested in he's trying to interject this kind of traditionalist view to actually bring it into political action. So that's why he's cozying up in the 40s with 30s to National Socialists and then to Mussolini and all that. And He died in 1973. But again, he's a dark star in the sense that, you know, he's brilliant. If only he used his mind for good instead of evil, you know, sort of like Dr. Moriarty or something like that with Sherlock Holmes kind of thing.
See, we need a Sherlock Holmes.
Huh?
We need a Sherlock Holmes. Now that you bring it up.
Well, this is the thing. You don't. Where are those these days?
I don't know. Well, I was going to ask you.
Where's that incorruptible, you know, kind of hero? I mean, they're not believable these days. You know, unless it's a Steven Spielberg movie or something. But I mean, I know I have to mention him. I'm just you know, tangentially. When I'm very depressed, I watch one of the old Basil Rathbone, Nigel Bruce Sherlock Holmes from the 1940s, when he's transposed into, you know, into the 40s and he's fighting the Nazis, and you say, it's like you cannot beat Sherlock. You know, it's like, but that would be a sign to these traditionalists that yes, we've lost any sense of nobility, and you know, we live in a time when corruption and you know, underhandedness and all of this is taken for granted, and the smart politician is the one who knows that's what's happening now, and you Machiavellianly you take advantage of it. And Trump is certainly, Putin, my God, he's been doing that for ages now. I mean, he's
from what you were writing,
he's one of the czars of old. He's like one of the czars of old.
In the Dark Star with Dugan, they seems like he was way ahead of Trump with the memes, and also he really talks about magic directly from the quotes you have in the book. So it's a little frightening, actually, in the sense that it's effective. It seems to be, and it needs to be countered in some way, but in a way that I don't know we're prepared to counter.
Well, that's the thing. You know, the rational approach is like, well, it's just a lot of wacky, crazy stuff, but it doesn't, you know, work. But I don't know. Trump did get elected, and Putin has, you know, he's been able to advance his aims and goals, some of which are informed by a very strange kind of mystical, occult kind of geopolitics that this fellow Dugan, and you know how much influence he has and all that kind of stuff. But if you know what Dugan is about, and if you've paid attention to what Putin's done and read some of his, you know, speeches and all that kind of thing, you can see he's certainly informed by it. And in fact, I was talking with a friend of mine, an old philosophy professor of mine, who just was in London, and we were talking about this election, all this kind of thing, and he said, like, well, you know, you write all these books about all these weird people, and you know, what is it with this with this guy in Russia? And I said, well, his main thing is like, you know, there's been one war throughout all of history, different participants, and the battles have been, you know, enacted in different places, but this fundamentally, there's one war between two fundamentally opposed kind of worldviews, and one is what Dugan calls the Atlanticists, which are the maritime mercantile nations, like the Britain, the United Kingdom, you know, the United States, and whatever other ones, you know, who roam the seas and are here and there and move around, and everything is commodity, and you know, it's all about, you know, market and all that kind of thing, the free market and laissez-faire. And the other side of that is what he calls Eurasia, the Eurasianists, and Eurasia is the largest landmass on the planet, which it reaches from Vladivostok to Dublin. In his view, it's like that's the mother of all continents is there. And you know, whereas the mercantile maritime nations are always negotiating everything and dealing everything and changing it, it's solid, and it's, you know, unchanging, and it's, you can see it's different between being and becoming, you know, in one metaphysical kind of sense. And so what Dugan's been saying, and Putin has said in several lectures, is, you know, what's been happening with Russia is not that, although for the West, rationally, Russia is now just as a nation, as a country, just like every other one, And you have to remember, this is the only time in Russian history when it's not been an empire. Throughout the entirety of Russia, except for the couple centuries when it was conquered by the Mongols in 1200s, around there, or something like that. But there's always been, in some form, an empire. And you always hear the phrase "all the Russias." So there's Russia and Belarus, which is White Russia. Ukraine was Little Russia, and, so it's all that kind of thing. And so he's saying, like, what's happening now is not that Russia's just another country like every other country. No, there's a whole new civilization rising up in Eurasia, which is not like the West. And this goes back to Oswald Spengler, who's this German philosopher of history in the early 20th century. He wrote this book called The Decline of the West. The Abendland, the Untergang des Abendlands, the undergoing of the evening lands, that's a lovely name for the West, the evening lands, because that's where the sun goes down. And it's this wonderful play on words. So it's the land where the sun goes down is going down itself. But it's been taking some time, so I tend to think of the recline of the West rather than the decline, because it's been sprawled out for over a century now. But the whole idea was that the West was going under, and a new civilization was going to arise. And these are the Titans. These are the age of the Caesars that Spengler talked about. And it was not a liberal, humanistic age. It was an age of, authoritarianism and kind of technocrat rule. The machine and all of that was going to, he's, in general sense, he's not far off. But Dugan, and from him and others, Putin kind of was echoing this notion where it's like, the West, and this is why he's presenting Russia as Holy Russia now. He's been wanting to reclaim this character that Russia had in the 19th century as, the last bastion of the true, Christian faith, against the West, which is increasingly more hedonistic and materialistic. And again, as I said, the Atlanticists want to turn the entire world into a shopping mall, which, in many ways that's happened. And that's why some people in the West are attracted to what Dugan is saying, and somehow through that they kind of see Putin as, if he's against the West, he mustn't be all that bad. Which is that's one of the really difficult things. This whole notion is like, well, if you somehow are against the people that I find questionable, then you must be okay. But actually, no. The whatever remedy you may find in the kind of ideas about life and society and all that Putin has is worse than the ill that you want to remedy it with. So, but that's one of the things. So this is. People talk about, again, it's not really a thing happening here, but in the States, is all the QAnon,
right,
sort of thing. I don't even know if that's still something or not. But the whole idea was like,
not as much.
Weird place. There's a weird, some kind of weird area in the whatever it is, the internet world, where far right people and kind of new agey people are kind of meeting. Because they have shared criticisms of whatever, and I say, well, yeah, that's where the far out and the far right come together. But that is in a way what was happening in Germany, just before National Socialism came into power and all that too. So I'm not saying there's an exact parallel, but it was a similar. And in Russia today, that's one of the things that there, I mean, if you, it is this whole kind of different science in many ways, a different sort of, I mean, I talk about it in the book a bit, and I go into a bit more in the Return of Holy Russia, the whole cosmist school, which is, there's a contemporary sort of, revitalization of that. And this was this strange school of kind of quasi weird occult science, which was talking about, bringing the dead back to life and colonizing planets and the forces from the stars and the sun and all these kind of things affecting, events on the planet and all the kind of stuff that people in the West would be like, what? what are you talking about? But this is stuff that prestigious scientists there, and thinkers, are engaging themselves with, and they have universities, involved in that kind of stuff. So it is a very, very different kind of world. And
in the West, we still have that far out there New Age people interacting with the alt-right. I mean, I know people personally that started taking those stands that were very alt-right during like Trump's era. Some were my neighbors. Then there was COVID. And I have to admit, it was initially quite shocking. I always knew there are people in all groups that you're not in a line with, but I didn't realize how popular. I even, knew someone that voted for Trump because he was an outsider, and it was someone I still like. And I was I just couldn't wrap my head around. I still can't quite get the attraction of it. I mean, I understand what you were saying, but just that once you look into it, you're like, oh my God, why would you be attracted to it? But they still are. There's a whole bunch of them.
Well, I mean, what do you want to say? Sadly, many people, they for whatever reason, they don't spend the time to really reflect on these things and look into them, because it's well, one can understand that, because once you start, we live in a time where I said it's like very difficult to, like, what should we say? In a way, these very extreme views are welcome, because you can kind of stay there. It's like, okay, I'm there. That's where I am, and I'm there. And whatever it is, that's the space I occupy. Whereas if you I don't know, what's the word, more reflective and aware of all the other possibilities, you find yourself kind of floating around and all that. And that's why I say we live in a time where everything's plausible and nothing's definite. You can almost get away with anything, saying anything, or claiming, oh, I believe such is the case, and you have to respect, not only respect it in the sense of saying, okay, that's fine, you could have your opinion, but no, I am compelling you to actually agree with me about it. And if you don't, then that's somehow some kind of infringement on my rights, in some way. That's the other weird thing too. There's a whole lot of magical thinking, I think, in media political world, in this notion of rights and all this kind of stuff, which I'm not. I don't want to. Of course, we all have rights and all that, but there's so many. It's like it. Well, I guess that's a thorny question. Like, where do each of our rights end? Yes, you have your right to say X, and I am X, and please, refer to me as X. And I'm happy to do that, but I'm only doing that because I respect your right to do that. But I don't really believe that you are X. But I'm no, you must, and if you don't, so it's like it's a very strange kind of time. Where said, like, our immediate sense of reality is what's challenged now.
Well, it's a way, it's a way we communicate.
Like, it's not only just like in the news, it's like in the street.
Sure.
It's like immediately your immediate encounters with people now. It's like, ooh, what,
It's a way that the effect of social media has had on us over a long period of time right now, that, there's arguments, I think, that are true, that it's changed our way of thinking, that quick, we're constantly, many of us, looking at these quick things. We don't read long books as much, and I've felt the split of the world was between virtual reality and just ordinary reality, in the sense that there is a real different civilization happening on the virtual reality, and to me it's quite real, and many people spend hours on it, and also they identify through virtual reality more than in person.
Well, isn't that kind of a magical reality, in the sense, or at least a hyper real or ultra real, or whatever prefix you want to use, where you're in control of it. You can determine what you want and all that to happen there. And that's the whole. I have to say, I have not done anything with AI yet, and I in a way I've determined not to do it. So I do. I wonder, this will certainly date me, but said, did anybody else see those movies in the 1970s when the computers and the robots and everything else
taking
I wasn't
over?
the only one watching these films. You know, did anybody else see them? You know,
Yeah.
it's like, and now it's like, oh yeah, well, actually that's what we want to happen now, sort of. You know, it's like, so you're like, oh, you just wonder what, you know. But yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing. Reality's up for grabs, and there's no guarantee who's going to grab it. And who's going to grab it is the people who's like, they're the first ones to go, the opportunists, and they have the money or whatever to
Right.
get the tech. But this is what, it's like a friend of mine, you know, this whole idea that in some way technology is mimicking or making possible the kind of things that once considered magical. So it's a kind of colonization of the kind of magical world by tech. It's, in a way, this is something that, you know, if I don't necessarily going to go there, but I mean, this is something that's been in the past, say, people having visions of what the future would be like 100 years on from them, say in the late 19th century. Then more than one of them had this kind of notion there would be some sort of, you know, before the final end, you know, before the Antichrist would ever arrives, there would be some kind of figure that would turn up on the world stage who'd be able to perform all these magical, you know, kinds of things, and he would have, you know, all the, and you wonder, so is this Elon Musk or you know, any of these other guys who are these kind of, you know, internet magi who can, you know, control everything and all that sort of stuff. So I don't know, I mean, I again, this is going back to the whole idea that somehow the alt-right used the internet in order to alter reality. And so this notion, what they call the synchromysticism, you know, again, it's a tech upgrade of synchronicity. But there, so that's the whole thing. So, you know, this permeation, you know, the barriers between the different levels of dimensions of reality and being have been kind of perforated, and everything's sort of sliding, you know, into each other. And, you know, it's, the imagination's a very good thing. You know, it's the book I did before Dark Star Rising, it's a book called Lost Knowledge of the Imagination. And that I'm looking at it as imagination as a way of knowing the world rather than escaping from it, which is how we tend to think of it, you know, make believe, is actually make real. But in the end of the book, and this was before I was, you know, writing Dark Star Rising, or even was asked to write it, I did voice, you know, a note of warning saying that, you know, play on the old cliche of, like, you know, the future world is in our hands. Well, it may be in our hands, but it's also in our minds, you know, and perhaps it's in our minds more than it is in our hands. And, you know, people like Rudolf Steiner, I mean, he said, like, one of the most bizarre things he said is that the future physical reality of the world would depend on the thoughts that people have now. And you know, who knows? You know, that does seem the kind of thing that's been transposed into a tech kind of world where, yeah, we can kind of make that happen. We can make you want to turn your thoughts into reality, we can do this. You know, here's the tech, we have to do this now.
Well, the tech also makes it
isn't the same as you doing it, you know, on your own through working on it. It's like, okay, here's the gizmos and gadget that'll do it for you. You know,
the tech makes it easier to have a group thought, and that's normally considered more powerful, though you could argue, like, still Tolkien created this whole amazing world on his own. So I don't know, there's still that ability for an individual to go deep into the imagination, but that tech has made it easier for the group mind to exist and to influence, and from bullying to positive things too. There are some also positive things, but it seems like it's often utilized initially at the lower levels. I'm not really sure why we people like to do that to each other, but humans do seem to like to take it out on each other.
Oh yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, that's it's one of the things too. Like what was unleashed, you know, with so social media, you know, became, you know, the way in which most people, or many people at least, you know, are communicating. And what was unleashed in that way was a great deal of rancor and animosity and, you know, vile kind of feelings and all that. And you think, well, just it's like, I don't know, it's again, I hear myself saying this and I sound naive, but I think like, well, it's like, well, it is like, they used to say about nuclear weapons, which is still the case. It's like, giving a child in a room full of, fireworks, a box of matches or something like that, and at some point they're going to light it and everything's going to go. It's like, but similarly now, I would say with, what's happening with whatever it is, AI or just people. I mean, you might say, okay, maybe it's cathartic, so people can get it out on social media, so they can let out all their dark side and the shadow side onto social media, and but does that mean necessarily when they're not on social media they're these wonderful loves?
I can't imagine not, some of them are. Maybe there is some. I know, some of them are probably, but
if you're, I would think if you're fuming away, vituperation on the net, and okay, I'm finished with that. Now I'm going to go. It's not a recipe, X amount of that shadow, whatever you want, expression, then I'm okay for the rest of the day. It just doesn't work like that. So, no, it's a weird thing in which, as you said, the latest, cutting edge technology has been used mostly for other kind of base, not even purposes. It's just kind of this kind of expression of, stuff that used to, maybe you might see on the bathroom wall somewhere.
Right.
The toilet, somebody might have scribbled on the wall, but now it's like, and it's even gone beyond that. Now it's like, what's real? What do you even see anymore? How do you know whether it's real or not?
You don't even know if it's a person doing it now. It could be a bot trying to get us all riled up over something. And I mean, more than ever, we have to use our minds and some sense of discernment about what we want to participate in. And we do have that choice. Most of us, maybe some people, if they have certain jobs, don't, but we have a choice. And you just wonder, I mean, it's, I'm sure there's also some really powerfully useful magic going on, but oftentimes these things are under the radar more. People doing things to help counter forces that we just don't know about, but it doesn't mean they're not happening.
Yeah, no, I think anyone who's like struggling with any of these kinds of questions is doing that,
Yeah.
Anybody out there is trying to, and going through states of confusion and not knowing, but still struggling to trying to keep their head above the waters there. And I mean, I tend to think, again, it's just a metaphor, but taking that notion of non-locality, it's been used to death in in quantum stuff, where there's the two particles, they were together, then they're not, but they still sort of know what they're doing, even though there's no media between the two of them to pass on any message, and how they could even, how they know they're just particles. And then also in the brain, when we're doing certain things, there's different neurons in the brain, they're not next to each other. So it's not as if they, one of them elbows the next one. They're not contiguous, they're not connected, but they fire whenever you're thinking this or you're reading that, whatever it might be. So they somehow know, but there's nobody right next to them tapping on the shoulder. So I somehow think on the planet, it's people like you, like me, and others around it. We don't necessarily know each other. We might not meet ever, but our individual efforts in some way are connected and may have an effect that we individually might not know. We might not know about that, but we somehow are contributing to it. So I like to think that's the case. So. But, it is difficult. And I think nowadays, I think the real thing is to make, God, I don't know. I mean, in some way, just retreat from all of it. But
that's actually helpful advice. I find myself doing that when things get sort of over the top on social media. I'm not a huge participant. I'm a very small, but then I'll withdraw completely for a while. And I do find that helps, and I feel like it helps you kind of stay out of the thick of it, and at least stay in your own lane, so to speak, and not get sort of pulled in. Or, but one of the things I have noticed personally, whenever I said this to my father, who's a metaphysical man, and I said, whenever something negative happened to Trump, something good would happen for us. I swear to God. It was like the day he was convicted, I forget what, like 3 things went through in our lives. And I've noticed that sort of trickle down in the US from leaders. I've noticed it for a long time, that I don't know why I do better under certain kinds of leaders. And whenever, Trump got more power, there was definitely a ripple effect in anyone that was really trying to contradict that kind of energy. At least I felt that, and some of the people I know felt that.
Well, I mean, I think there is those kind of, currents there, and one may feel the effect of them without necessarily knowing, where it's coming from, and all of that, and but it's I don't know. We'll see. What do you think is going to happen with the election, coming up? Because over here, it's like, well, it seems like a no-win situation in the sense.
Well,
like,
yeah,
if he doesn't win, it's going to be
right.
Whatever, they stole the election again.
Exactly.
And if he does, then it's like, oh, that's even worse, sort of. So, but I don't know. What does it feel like there? So
I'm now on the fence. I think after when Hillary lost the first time, I think that changed everything for me in terms of being able to sense sort of what was going to happen on some level. And even though he's been convicted, the fact that Trump raised all that money right away was very disturbing. And there's just something was unleashed in the United States that I don't think many people realized was so strong. I mean, we knew there was that undercurrent of racism and all that. So I want to say I don't think he'll be elected, but I'm sort of on the fence because he's come this far again. And I think anything is possible, depending on who goes out to vote. I guess that's what it is.
Well, that's that idea that anything is possible. So when you open that box, it's, there's no guarantee what's gonna come out of it. So there's all that. There's so many questions about, I'm in one sense, I'm just like everybody else. I'm the average person watching the news. So, like Biden, I guess he's preferable, but I guess there's, I get the impression his popularity rating is rather low there. I don't know if that's really the case. And then there was all this kind of recent stuff about his son in the news and all that.
Yeah, Hunter. Yeah.
So,
I think his popularity went up a little bit recently with his speech, Biden's, and and I know polls aren't always accurate based on past elections. So, but there is this whole meme around Biden that is he's too old, and Trump is old too, but no one ever says that about him. It's sort of attached to Biden. He's just too old.
Who does he? Who's his vice president? Running mate, do we know?
I don't think we know yet. I think it's maybe going to be revealed. I don't know. I don't know. Right. There's a definite one. Yeah. So as I say, well, here I said we have a kind of like Trump light. This Nigel Farage, who's in a way, I say in Dark Star Rising, he and the UKIP, UK Independence Party, who were the ones behind Brexit. Britain leaving the European Union. That kind of started. That was like the first kind of dislodgement, sort of like the old new world order sort of thing. that started, and then that, in a way, that's sort of my impression was that, this far right stuff can kind of work. We can make things happen. And then Trump was elected after that, and recently now in Europe, there's been in the European Union, there's actually been a great increase in far right's presence in that as well. And this is like, who's it, Macron? I don't even know what became of that. He called some snap election after that. So there is, it does seem to be there. It just seems to be and even I said I met with this old professor of mine, and he even sort of shaking his head, saying, I don't know, democracy. It might just not be sort of maybe it's up in the air. So I think we're getting pretty close.
One hopes that's not the case, but it would be kind of, my God, who wants to live in a world like that?
No, we have to fight for it. It's definitely worth fighting for. But I do think people can't take it for granted. So
No, that's true. But
so-
I mean, you can do some positive thinking of your own.
exactly.
I mean, one and some talks I've given about this, I refer to a classic book, Psychic Self-Defense by Dion Fortune,
Great book.
who was one of the great magicians of the 20th century, and he basically talks about how one can protect oneself from kind of psychic attack. But one of the things she talks about in it was this notion of the tulpa, which is comes out of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and it's a kind of like mental image that becomes real. And she tells a story where she worked on creating this image of a wolf, and actually the wolf became real, and
Right.
it's like out in the neighborhood. One of the things, so she somehow had to draw it back in, and it took an enormous amount of work. And then and someone else who had a similar experience was Alexander David Neal, who's one of these fantastic women travelers in the early 20th century. And she was, if not one of the first women to get into Lhasa, into Tibet. But where she was there studying with, the Tibetan lamas, she created a tulpa, and it was like another monk. And then it took on a life of its own. And the lama had said, no, you must take care of this tulpa. He's causing a lot of trouble. He's eating all the rice and stuff like that. But she had to absorb it. And in the book, I can't go into it, but I have wondered, maybe Trump is a tulpa in a way.
So we have to somehow get rid of him now.
Materialize him. And this is what Dion Fortune said. You have to sort of imagine the tulpa again, but then you do the opposite. Instead of bringing it into being, you have to sort of imagine it dematerializing. So,
well, I think that's
nothing else. Maybe if you can arrange
I think that's a great way to end the show. I'm so sorry we ran out of time now. So I really appreciate that's a good way to end it.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for coming on. It was really fascinating.
My pleasure, absolutely. Thank you.
And join us next time as we continue to explore the esoteric and the obscure together. Have a great week.